welcome to a new lecture of the module Decision Making for Autonomous Robots. My name is Marija, and in this lecture we're going to cover robotic exploration and informative planning. We bring together everything we have learned in previous lectures on robotic decision making and planning, and see how we can make robots perform intelligent and directive actions in information gathering tasks. So if we place a robot with a sensor in an environment, we wanted to build a map and eventually reason about the next best locations it should take measurements at. In this lecture, we're going to tackle this by addressing two distinct but related problems: robotic exploration and robotic data collection. We're going to see some of the key properties associated with each of these problems, some of the challenges related to them, and eventually also look at some solution algorithms in each of these scenarios. So first of all, what do we mean by robotic information gathering, and why are robots involved at all? Well, by information gathering, we simply mean that we place a sensor in some environment and use it to collect some measurements in order to build a map. Here we see examples of information gathering scenarios that are done manually with humans directly in the loop. Often information gathering scenarios, especially in large environments, can be very cumbersome. They take up a lot of time, and they're also very expensive due to the labor costs involved. And some examples are placing static sensors using manual sampling or conventional manned aircraft. So as a solution, in recent years, we have started to use robots to tackle these challenges and eventually replace or complement some of these more traditional methods for data collection. And in this way, we hope to overcome these shortcomings and bring new benefits in terms of saved time, labor, and also money. So we can say that robotic information gathering seeks to collect measurements about a particular environment of interest using a sensor on board the robot. So the robot is acting essentially as a mobile sensor by moving around in the environment. And also a key aspect is the fact that the paths that we generate for information gathering and the algorithms that we deploy need to abide by the robot's platform constraints. So the goal of robotic information gathering is to generate these paths for efficient data collection. Efficiency is a key word here because it relates to the robot's platform constraints. So because if we use a very small robot, we might be extremely constrained in its battery life and computing capacity. So robotic information gathering seeks to tackle these problems and generate very efficient ways of using these limited resources on board physical platforms in order to collect data in the most efficient or the most informative way. So if we have a robot with a limited budget, say on battery life, we want to deploy it in a mission, use intelligent decision making for robotic information gathering, and eventually receive back the most useful measurements that it could possibly collect with the limited amount of time and the resources that it has. So in these pictures, we can see some more examples of scenarios where robotic information gathering is applicable. So over here we have an aerial scenario where we have an unmanned aerial vehicle or a UAV monitoring a field of crops with a downward-facing camera. So the goal here could be to measure some parameters of the plants, such as biomass, or to find particular weeds in the field among the crops that need targeted intervention. Another example over here in the second column is an autonomous surface vehicle. So in this case, the autonomous surface vehicle has a probe that is able to measure bacteria concentrations in the lake in which it is navigating in. And by moving the sensor probe, it can, in a targeted way, collect information about where bacteria concentration is the highest in this lake. And finally, here we have a very general illustration of a 3D mapping scenario, a very complicated one, where a robot is deployed with, let's say, a laser scanner or a camera, and we want it to explore an unknown environment and map as efficiently as possible. This is the robotic information gathering for exploration task. So if we want to start to construct a system diagram or figure out how do we start to approach this problem, we can construct an autonomous architecture of what's happening inside the robot when it's actually performing these tasks. And here we see individual modules, key competencies that the robot needs for information gathering popping up, and then we discuss some of the challenges associated with each of them. So let's build up slowly a system diagram of what kind of algorithms or which modules do we need to achieve robotic information gathering from a systems perspective. So first of all, of course, we need a sensor that we use to collect measurements in the environment. So this could be a camera, whether it's an RGB camera, multispectral camera, a laser scanner, any type of sensor. And for this, we obtain some kind of raw measurements. We also have, in this lecture, we assume that we have a known state estimation of where the robot is in the environment. So we don't need to simultaneously figure out where the robot is in the environment as well as collect measurements. For purposes of this lecture, we're going to assume that we have a state estimation system that's working and providing us some estimate of the robot's pose and odometry. And so typically we use this information from the sensor and the state estimator, and we obtain some kind of processing on the raw sensor measurements. And sometimes this does not necessarily have to include information about the robot's pose. So one example could be taking raw camera images in the scenario where the UAV is doing crop monitoring, and then we use a classifier to figure out where crops and weeds are. So this could be one example of an operation happening in the processing unit here. So the processing unit then provides us with measurements, and these measurements are the key information we need to construct a map of the environment. So the map is simply the variable that we are interested in measuring in its spatial distribution at a particular point in time. And then when we do mapping, we may also have some prior information about the map coming in that we want to exploit. So these could be, for instance, previous trials or experiments that we have done, and we know something about the environment and would like to incorporate this in our map. This data stream may or may not be present, of course. And then the key component in robotic information gathering is that we now start to use this map in order to generate informative plans for data collection. So we use the current state of the map, and we have some transformation operation here that uses the map data to calculate information gain of particular points. So this is right now just on an abstraction level how these modules are interconnected. And so we have the map, and we look at the data that we have in the map, and from this we can extract information that we pass to our planning algorithm to generate trajectories for the robot to follow. A key aspect here is that we've actually closed the loop between perception and action. So now as we have the map data coming in, we can reason about it and decide to tell the robot what to do next. And in the planning algorithm, we also have a stream associated with the robot pose, because of course we're planning from the current robot position the following trajectories or paths. So we have the sensor providing us with measurements after some processing operation. We have the map from which we can extract information value, or so-called the utility, the usefulness of particular measurements. And then we have the planning algorithm that takes this information and figures out what should the robot physically do in the real world to collect measurements, and sends this then to the controller for trajectory following and actual physical execution. So a key ingredient here is this utility function, which takes the map information and converts it into usefulness or utility value. So we go into more details about this component later on in this lecture, But just to give some intuition, one example could be if we want the robot to explore an environment, as we saw in the example, as efficiently as possible. A measure of the utility could be how much uncovered space does the robot see with respect to the current state of the map. In this case, the utility takes in the map, sees which information is missing, and then from this provides some measure of the reward of how promising future locations to take measurements would be. Another example in the UAV monitoring a field case, agricultural field, could be that we want the robot to focus on areas where there is particularly high biomass. So if there is high biomass, it could be that there are some infestations there, excessive plant growth, and we want the robot to focus in a targeted way on these areas. So in this case, we have a map of what the biomass cover on the field looks like, and we can threshold out areas that are particularly high biomass and use this to compute the utility or the information value that we then use for planning. These are just some examples to develop a feel for what the utility calculation could look like and some meaningful applications there. So if we want to formalize a bit more mathematically the robotic information gathering problem, we can state it as follows. So objective is to map a particular area of interest accurately, as quickly as possible, or as efficiently. So our goal is to find a trajectory or a path for maximum gain in an information measure or utility measure, given a cost budget in terms of the robot's finite resources. So this could be limited battery life, limited endurance. So essentially, if we have a limited budget and the robot cannot collect measurements in an exhaustive way, we want to use informative planning in order to find the most efficient paths for data collection. So here we have the budget limitation. This is usually formulated in terms of the path length or time. And we have the fact that we want to maximize the information gain or the utility associated with potential measurements. So here I is a general or a generic utility function, and measure is a function which takes in the trajectory and gives us whatever we measured at that location. So this function gives us a way of evaluating how promising trajectories or paths are. Because if we can derive ways of calculating information gain given measurements obtained from a trajectory, we have a way of comparing different trajectories and then picking the best one in our planning algorithm. So this is like our planning objective function or reward function as to what the robot should do when it has multiple options. And note here the difference between our previous lecture on classical planning, where the objective was to find the shortest path. Here, the path that brings the highest information gain, the highest utility, is not necessarily the one that's also the shortest. In fact, very often it is not. The most promising path is the one that gives us the highest gain in terms of information value, given the limited budget constraints. So now we can bring this together with our system diagram and look at a particular example as to how these components from the modules that we have seen fit in. Or say, just as an illustrative example, we look at the UAV monitoring a field of crops here. So the UAV wants to generate these trajectories in order to maximize information value of whatever it is measuring in the field, for example, the high biomass cover. So there are many challenges associated with solving this problem in terms of the key components on the system diagram. So first of all, we need to decide how do we model the environment in this scenario. And we need the map to support the types of measurements that we get from the sensor. And we also need it to be suitable for fusing new data efficiently. it also needs to give us the information that we need for planning and for solving the information gathering problem here. So a second set of challenges is associated with the calculation of the utility. So what we're doing here is mapping key aspects of this problem scenario to the elements on the system diagram. So in terms of the utility, we need a way of actually specifying and defining the information measure here so that we can say how promising particular actions are in the future. And this is a very challenging task. And finally, we have the planning algorithm and a set of challenges associated with that, which takes in particular measurement locations that we want to visit and outputs a physical plan given the robot workspace. So on the next slides, we're going to go in more detail about the specific challenges in each of these categories, and then later on in the lecture, contextualize them with respect to particular planning and information gathering applications. So let's see some of the challenges associated with mapping. As we said, a key aspect here is how do we represent the environment of interest with respect to the variable that we are monitoring. So we need to make sure that a representation of the environment can support the types of measurements that we extract for the sensor, and also gives us the key information that we need in order to extract utility values for informative planning. And this is a very challenging task. So what are some of the things that we need to consider? First, obviously, is what is the dimensionality of the environment? So where are we taking the actual measurements in physical space? Some problems are 2D. For example, the case of a UAV monitoring an agricultural field or any terrain. If we only have a top-down view, a 2D or a 2.5D representation would be sufficient. But in the case of a robot monitoring a room or even a city, we might need large 3D maps to capture all the structural information associated with that environment. And second, importantly, we need to ask ourselves, what is the nature of the target variable that we are mapping? So a key distinction here is whether the variable being monitored is continuous or discrete. So does it vary smoothly or not? So if we're measuring something like temperature in data collection, as we will see, we have very smooth variations, and we need a map representation that supports this type of phenomenon. Next, often we need probabilistic maps to accommodate uncertain or noisy sensor measurements. So we need a map that, rather than stitching together all the measurements that we obtain from the sensor, actually can perform probabilistic updates and account for that uncertainty information. This is also a very essential component for planning, as we will see, because information is often based on the uncertainty as well as the value of whatever it is that we're measuring. We might also need multi-resolution maps for efficiency reasons. So rather than mapping everything in the environment at a uniform resolution, for example, with a uniform grid, we want to group in larger cells in the grid case areas that are less interesting in order to save computation time as well as memory. And very related to this is just generally thinking about the computational and memory efficiency of the algorithms and how much computation and memory space does it actually need in terms of integrating new measurements into the map and querying the map as well. And as we will see when we talk more about planning, if we want to plan in an online way during the mission, especially with limited computational resources on physical platforms, then it is essential to have a map representation that is computationally and memory efficient enough in order to allow us this type of behavior in online planning. And so this is one example where cases or techniques such as multi-resolution mapping or sub-mapping could be valuable in order to save us in some of these aspects. So what are some examples of maps? So here we can see Octomap, which we have probably seen in previous lectures. And the Octomap is a 3D occupancy map representation that uses an octree structure in order to efficiently perform map updates. And so here we see different height slices of the map colored in different ways. And we have a discrete representation where each cell in 3D or each voxel captures the occupancy probability at that particular point. So this type of map representation would be very suitable for a robotic exploration task where we're interested in mapping the occupancy. In data collection, as we see later, a common map representation to use is the Gaussian process, which is a machine learning technique allowing us to capture correlated data in a parametric way. And so the key advantage of the Gaussian process, as we see, is that it is able to capture correlations between the data. So in this particular example, we have wireless signal strength measurements collected on top of a lake in this region. And using the Gaussian process, we're able to obtain this smooth behavior because the measurements are all related to each other due to the nature of the target variable, that is the signal strength that we're mapping. So these are just some examples of maps that are commonly used in informative planning applications. Next, there is a set of challenges associated with the utility function. And this is perhaps the most interesting one and the most one unique to informative planning, because we have this notion of usefulness in our objective function that tells us intuitively and from a mission aim perspective how useful is it for me if I take a measurement at that location. So typically we develop utility functions based on decision or information theoretic principles with respect to the map representation. So information theoretic measures account for the uncertainty in the map and the sensor measurements. And so they're very suitable for informative planning with probabilistic map representations. And by their nature, they tell us something about the potential information gain that we will acquire if we take measurements at a particular location. So these are often designed from information theoretic theories, such as entropy, for example, is one extremely commonly used measure that we use for informative planning. And we predict the entropy associated with future measurements and then see which one lead to the highest information gain. A second key aspect that we need to think about a little bit is whether we need an adaptive algorithm. An adaptive algorithm allows plans to change online as new measurements are collected. So basically, adaptivity is required when we want the robot to focus in a targeted way at particular locations in the environment because we define them as being interesting to explore further. If not, then the entire environment is mapped in a uniform way. And for example, our objective might only be to go for uncertainty reduction, which we can often pre-compute. So in contrast, adaptivity allows the robot to see and analyze the measurements that it's getting with respect to the map by integrating them in the map, and then design next plans based on that current information. So the map is continuously updated online during the mission, and the plans are regenerated. So there is replanning happening online. So adaptivity is very attractive in many monitoring applications. For example, if you want to focus on weeds or map high bacteria concentration levels, but in practice, this very much influences the type of utility functions that we use and the planning algorithms, because this means that our algorithms need to be run online and in real time, often on board very computationally constrained platforms. So adaptivity is very advantageous, oftentimes from an application point of view, but adds significant computational overhead. And finally, as we might already understand by thinking and discussing informative planning, a key aspect is a predictive sensor model. So we need a tool which allows us to judge the information value of future measurements. So we need to predict what the sensor would see at a particular point were the robot to move there. Only this way can we have this type of predictive forecasting behavior that allows us to evaluate different candidate actions based on the utility function and select the best one. An example of a sensor model, as we see later for exploration planning, is the camera field of view. So if we position the robot at a given location, we can project the receptive field of the camera in the current state of the map and use this to predict, for example, the amount of unexplored area that the robot would see were it able to move there. However, in general, developing the predictive sensor model is a very tricky thing in informative planning, and it is a subject of many ongoing research. So here again, some of the examples of these specific challenges associated with the utility calculation. So here we have an illustration of adaptive behavior. So just to explain what this picture is illustrating, on the top in 3D we see a trajectory traveled by a UAV. So this is a UAV traveling in 3D monitoring a 2D field, just like in the agricultural monitoring example. So the dots here show the locations that the UAV took measurements at, whereas the line shows its travel trajectory using an informative planning approach. And on the bottom, we can see a very binary type of terrain landscape that it is monitoring from a top-down view. So at each of these measurements, the camera on board the UAV registers the image and fuses it into the map. So the yellower shades here correspond to higher values of the target parameter, whereas the bluer shades correspond to lower values. So this is what the map looks like in this environment. And in an adaptive case here, it was specified that the UAV should focus on higher valued regions. So as we said in the examples, this could be high biomass, for example, in the agricultural monitoring scenario. So we can see that the informative planning using an adaptive approach has actually collected much more measurements on the side of the environment where the value of the target parameter is higher. And this is because as it explored the space, it has detected after a couple of measurements that this one side of the field is rather uninteresting. It only contains lower or bluer values of the parameter. And the other side is actually much more interesting for adaptive targeted planning case. So as a result, we see much more measurements appearing on that side here. This is just a very artificial example to illustrate adaptive behavior in robotic informative planning. So because our algorithm was adaptive and we were able to specify in our utility function that we're more interested in the yellower regions, as a result, our planning algorithm generated much more measurements here for data collection. This could be, the adaptive criterion could be defined in different ways. It does not necessarily have to be only the higher values. We could also define it in lower values or a particular range or interval. But this is just one illustrative example. And over here we see example sensor model, just like was mentioned previously. So here we have a robot that's in a 2D indoor environment in a sort of corridor where the black cells represent occupied in this occupancy map. The white is free and the gray is unknown. So we kind of detected that the robot has several places that it could go to these frontiers of the environment where it hasn't been before. And we used the sensor model of the robot's field of view with this camera to predict how many unexplored cells at these frontiers it will see were it to go there. So we go into much more detail about identifying frontiers and exploration later on in the lecture, but the key thing to take away is that the robot field of view and this projection is the predictive sensor model that we actually need to calculate utility if we want to predict future measurements. So we kind of say, okay, if the robot moved to this point, we were able to hallucinate somehow the potential measurements that it will take, and from this extract the utility and eventually compare between different actions to solve the information gathering problem. So already we can see the interconnectivity between different elements of the informative planning approach, because our adaptive behavior in the utility function also depends on the map representation. So here the map is continuous, it has a range of values, and we can see that the exploration path planning algorithm coming into play when we discuss the predictive sensor model here. So these challenges are in no way isolated. They really depend on each other, but we need to think about them and each component very carefully depending on the application that we're targeting. Finally, we have a set of challenges emerging from the actual path planning algorithm itself. Remember, the path planning unit from the system diagram is the one that takes the information value associated with different measurement locations based on the utility function and then connects them somehow to give us a path or a trajectory for the robot to follow in the physical world. Not surprisingly, for planning with this objective function, for information gathering, the challenges are rather similar to those we saw when we looked at the classical path planning problem of finding the shortest path. First, we need to decide whether we want to plan paths in a discrete or continuous representation of the robot workspace. So in the discrete case, we have some underlying grid of potential actions for the robot as to where it can travel, and we only consider those when planning. In contrast, in the continuous space, we looked at the entire robot workspace and set of possibilities. And while continuous space planning might lead to more effective plans in terms of information quality gathered along them, not surprisingly, they tend to be more computationally expensive. Another key consideration is the look ahead that we want to use when planning. So we have two distinctions in terms of the look ahead a path planning algorithm uses. So first we have myopic planners, which are greedy in the sense they only look one step ahead when they consider the next action to take. In contrast, non-myopic or more far-sighted planners implement some kind of horizon to reason over the sequence of measurements a robot would take. Myopic planning can be very efficient in the sense that it only looks at the next possible action, but it can also lead to the robot getting stuck in local minima. For example, one could imagine if there is a corner where the robot hasn't been to before, it might travel there to collect a lot of information, but then get stuck in an area where there's not much other information value to be gathered if it were to leave in any direction. Then, thirdly, we need to think about characteristics of online replanning. Replanning means that we recompute the paths online by running our algorithm during the mission. And this is necessary and related to the idea of adaptivity, because if we would like adaptive planning, so the robot to adjust its path based on the new measurements that were collected during the mission, then online replanning is necessary because we want to be able to plan new paths taking this data into account. So bringing all these aspects together, one final aspect is that of computational and memory efficiency or a planning algorithm. And a theme that we start seeing to arise here is the fact that in informative planning, a key trade-off arises between the quality of informative paths that we plan for data collection and the computational and memory efficiency of our algorithms. Because the problems that we're tackling are so challenging, it's impossible to do exhaustive searches and also do on-run replanning with the adaptivity requirements. So we need to manage some sort of trade-off there. So in general, our planning algorithm will depend on many factors, depending on the type of representation of the robot workspace, as well as the map, whether it's 2D or 3D, which is obviously more computationally heavy, as well as the look ahead that we use for planning and how quick is it to compute the utility function. So importantly, a key focus of research currently in informative planning is how do we generate informative paths, but also allow them to be run onboard physical platforms with limited computational resources and keep replanning during the mission. And so here are some examples to illustrate planning aspects. So a simple one here is the distinction between discrete and continuous paths. So in purple here we can see a grid-based path that was generated by only considering a set of points in the environment regularly spaced along the grid. Whereas in green we see different paths that were generated by the robot through continuous informative path planning. And obviously even the objective functions were the same for this problem, depending on the type of path parameterization and path representation that we use here, we will get significantly different results depending on the requirements of our application. And then another aspects illustrated here are that of look ahead and runtime. So on the left we can see a next best view planner that plans based on a sampling based algorithm in the 3D space in the problem of inspecting a bridge scenario. And so here we want to explore as much of the bridge as possible in this environment. On the top we can see the trajectories that are generated by the algorithm, and on the bottom the final octomap, which is the map representation here that we use to capture occupancy. And on the left is a next best view sampling based strategy, as we said. On the right, a simple frontier based planner which implements a myopic greedy exploration strategy, just going to the next best possible waypoint to see as much of this bridge as possible. And due to the differences in the look ahead of this particular algorithm and simple frontier-based planning and runtime, we can see that the frontier-based exploration strategy only completed a partial exploration of the bridge and was unable to complete the model. So this is one of the motivations for developing more sophisticated algorithms and actually taking into account these trade-offs so that we can do such tasks in real time and with real robots. There are many variations of the robot information gathering problems that are found in literature. They're often very related, but on the next two slides, we just want to make clear the problems that we address in the context of this lecture and how they are different. So the first problem that we'll consider is that of robotic exploration. So we have a robot in a partially known or an unknown environment. We have a sensor placed on board the robot, and we wanted to move to map as much of the environment as possible. This is what we mean by the robotic exploration problem. And here we see an example of a UAV moving in an indoor environment, creating an octomap, which is the commonly used map representation for these types of problems. So here we have a cluttered environment, and as the robot is exploring, it also needs to make sure that the paths that it generates don't collide with any of the obstacles. And the second key problem that we consider is robotic data collection or robotic environmental monitoring. And here we have a phenomenon of interest in an environment, for example, temperature, moisture, weed coverage, biomass coverage in an agricultural scenario, and we want to use the robot sensors to collect information about that environmental phenomenon. So in the sense, data collection is, or rather robotic exploration is simply a way of casting the data collection problem, because we're still gathering data and collecting information about occupancy, but we want to draw the distinction here because the map representations that we often use, as we will see, are rather different because of the differing nature in the target variables in environmental monitoring and in creating an occupancy map representing the structure of the environment itself. Then in literature, we might also see different related problems to these, and sometimes they overlap. So just to become aware of some of the terminology that often arises in this field of study, we have a very related to the exploration problem is the inspection planning problem, which is when we have a known model of an environment and we want to plan a path in order to efficiently inspect it. So given the robot resource limitations, we want to plan a path to see as much of the structure or air or field as much as possible. And this is typically what the problem formulation is when we see approaches in this category. Then, if we want to take temporal information into account as well, a related problem is persistent monitoring. This is when the environment is changing over time and we want the robot to revisit locations to update the map. This is rather intuitive and simple to understand. For example, if a temperature field is varying, cooling down or heating up, this is where persistent monitoring would be very applicable. However, it throws in a whole new set of challenges in our informative planning framework, and this is not a topic that we cover in this lecture, but it's important to know that it's out there and be aware. And finally, in the practical case, when robot localization is uncertain, so we don't know the robot pose, we can only estimate it as the robot explores an unknown environment. Field of study commonly addressing this problem is called active simultaneous localization and mapping. So active here means that the robot is somehow reacting to the information it acquires as it's doing simultaneous localization and mapping in an unknown environment. And in these problems, we have a multi-objective function where we want to minimize the uncertainty in the robot pose estimate, as well as the map exploration or the quality of the map that the robot is uncovering during its mission. So again, these are just some variations of the robot information gathering problem. Sometimes the techniques that we use in these fields of study are very overlapping as well. But on the next slides, we focus on exploration and data collection. In the next part of the lecture, we focus on informative planning for the application of robotic exploration. As we said, the goal of exploration is to deploy the robot in a previously unknown or partially unknown environment, use its sensor to collect measurements and complete the map as quickly as possible given its limited resources. This type of capability could be extremely useful in many applications, including industrial inspection, search and rescue, tunnel mapping, and many more. On the bottom, we can see two specific examples of UAV-based exploration scenarios in indoor environments. On the left, a UAV is inspecting a scaffold in an industrial inspection scenario. And on the left, we can see an occupancy map that was generated using the measurements acquired. On the right, in a very similar problem, a UAV explores an indoor area and mapping a staircase. So what are the key ingredients that are common to both of these problems of robotic exploration? Well, our problem setup consists of a robot equipped with a sensor, such as a laser scanner or a camera that it uses to take the measurements to build the map. And then we have typically an occupancy grid-based map representation that tells us the probability of a particular location in the environment being occupied or not. And this is what we saw in the previous slides with the colors. These are color-coded occupancy maps associated with the exploration missions of these two robots. And thirdly, we need a way of comparing different exploration algorithms and telling us how good they are. So common performance metrics we consider here are the exploration time, so the total time it takes the robot to complete the exploration problem and see everything in the environment. And we can also consider map quality, or the confidence associated with the observed areas, and trying to reduce that uncertainty. Mathematically, in terms of the map, we can formulate the exploration problem in such a way. So if we have a bounded 3D space, we can partition it into subvolumes of free space and occupied space. And now the union of free and occupied space is nothing but the total volume minus any residual volume. And the residual volume is the space that the robot physically cannot see, no matter which pose it positions its sensor at, because this is the volume associated with narrow pockets or surfaces that cannot be inspected. So in the exploration problem, when the robot has uncovered all the free and occupied space, then we consider the task to be complete, and this is our ultimate aim. And so now on this point, on the next slides, we're going to focus on the occupancy grid map and present a brief refresher of the key concepts and update strategies for the occupancy grid. Now, this is just designed as a recap because the occupancy grid is an essential component of robotic mapping and exploration, but it is very recommended to go back and look at more lectures in detail on mapping if some parts are not clear. And so the occupancy grid map is a common way of representing the structural information in an environment in a probabilistic way. The key idea is to divide the environment into cells using a fixed resolution, as we saw in the examples. And each cell, or each voxel in 3D, is a binary random variable representing the probability of occupancy. So if we have a cell whose occupancy probability is 0, then that cell is considered free. Whereas if the occupancy probability of the cell is 1, then it's considered to be occupied by an obstacle and the robot cannot travel there. Now we make certain assumptions when designing the occupancy grid. One of them that the area of the cell is either completely free or occupied. So we cannot subdivide the space further, even though in the physical world we might have obstacles which only cover parts of cells. This is an assumption that we make so that we can enable this abstraction and this model of the physical world. Next, we assume that adjacent cells in the occupancy grid map are independent of each other, so there are no structural correlations. If we update one cell, this information does not in any way propagate to the adjacent one if it was not seen with the same measurement. Next, we assume that the state is static, so there are no temporal variations in the environment, no dynamic behavior. And for purposes of this lecture, we assume that we have a state estimation system that's providing us with the robot pose that we use to do mapping. In simultaneous localization and mapping, this is not the case because we're trying to jointly learn the robot pose as well as the environment. But for this lecture and exploration, we assume that we simply have to project the measurements the robot receives from a pose and that pose is actually provided to us by the state estimator. And based on these principles, we can say that the probability distribution of an occupancy grid map is simply the products of the probabilities of its cells. Now, how do we update the map? So if we receive new measurements from the robot sensor, we can use a binary Bayes filter to fuse that new information into the current state of the map. And this is often done in practice using the log odds notation of probability, which is a very efficient way of updating individual cells with new measurements. So in this pseudocode, if a cell lies in the perceptual field of the robot, so if it was observed by the robot at a particular measurement location, all we have to do is sum the new measurement based on an inverse sensor model and subtract a prior value if we have any information about it. And important to note is that this update only happens in the cells that were actually registered by the sensor, or in other words, in its perceptual field. Now, how do we define the sensor model? So this highly depends on the physical world and the properties the sensor exhibits there in terms of its behavior. So if we have a laser scanner, we essentially shoot beams and figure out the perceived depth along that beam, registered by the robot. So for the sensor beam, we have such distance-dependent variation of occupancy probability. So assuming we registered an obstacle at Z here, all the cells between the robot's current position and the hit, so Z, at that distance would be considered as being a high probability of being free. So this is the information that we have acquired here by shooting that beam. Then on the surface, we have a very high peak of high occupancy probability because there's likely to be a surface there. That's what our sensor tells us by registering a hit. And the remainder beyond the obstacle is often considered based on a prior value. Now, if we have a dense sensor such as a camera, then we can apply similar principles, but we need to account for the fact that we have now an image with different pixels. So we need to project the pixels to physical locations in the physical world, figure out which voxel cells these are associated to, and then do the map update. So the key takeaway is that in order to perform occupancy map updates, we have a very efficient Bayesian probabilistic way of doing this, and with log odds notation, we can do it using simple summation operations. Now, occupancy grids look something like this. So in a two-dimensional environment, we have a robot that traveled a sort of loop around this large environment here. And on the purplish, we see unknown areas that the robot has not seen, whereas the walls are in black and free space is in white. And on the left, we see a color-coded by height 3D version of an occupancy grid, the so-called OctoMap, which performs the map updates and stores the map information in an efficient way using octrees. So this is exactly the type of map representation that was used in the UAV examples, since they were exploring 3D environments, also using their ability to change height to take measurements. And now we have actually all the ingredients that we need to come up with a basic robot exploration strategy. So an initial and very intuitive idea that we could have is, let's say we're exploring in an environment, why don't we just move the robot to unknown areas? So these unknown regions are, have a particular name. They're called frontiers. A frontier is a border between the free and unknown space in an environment. It's so-called the edge of the exploration area for the robot. So here we see an example in a very simple 2D occupancy grid map where we have some obstacles that were previously detected, free space, the robot in the center, and then the red cells are the ones that correspond to frontiers because they're on the boundary between this free space the robot knows is there and the unexplored space, which is unknown. And in order to identify frontiers, not surprisingly, we need to set some thresholds on what we consider to be free and occupied space. So depending on how we change these thresholds and how strict we are with them, we can make our exploration strategy more or less conservative. So the frontiers correspond to these unknown regions, sort of around 0.5, which corresponds to being equal probability of being free and occupied. And these are potential candidate promising areas where if the robot were to go there, it could go to another room or discover a new area and collect more information there, exploring this environment. On this slide, we can see another example of frontier detection. So on the left we see a partially explored environment where the white is free space, the large black dots are occupied cells, and the small ones are unknown. And based on this partially explored map, we can extract the frontiers as the boundary between the free and unknown space. And then we can cluster these frontiers and figure out potential promising locations for robot exploration tasks. And a very simple way of doing exploration, if we know these frontier regions, is to simply greedily go to the nearest frontier given the current robot pose. This is a very traditional and easy way of doing robot exploration, simply based on the map state and frontier extraction. And all we need is two components. So we need to detect the frontiers in the map somehow, and then we need a shortest path planning algorithm for the robot from the current pose to the nearest frontier. And for this we can use an algorithm that we already know, such as A star. This is a very easy and myopic way of simply going for the next best view and exploring the space. And because our decision-making strategy is based on unknown areas, if we give it enough time, the environment will be completely explored in terms of the occupied and free space. Here is a more practical example of greedy frontier-based exploration in a 2D environment. So on the left we can see the starting map of the robot, where the red are the frontier cells. And as the robot navigates from frontier to frontier, we can see that it uncovers more of the free and occupied space before eventually completing the exploration task and completing the map. And so importantly, we need a way of judging the map state at a particular time in the exploration mission so that we can extract frontiers. Now, while this myopic greedy strategy works very well for simple environments, it does have several drawbacks. And these drawbacks have been the foundation of more advanced exploration studies and new state-of-the-art methods in robot exploration, especially in high-dimensional spaces. What we're going to do next is look at some of these aspects of greedy frontier-based exploration and see how we can improve them to develop more advanced exploration techniques. So the first exploration is that when we decided on where the robot should go next in our simple examples, we did not explicitly make use of the robot sensor model. Our frontier detection strategy was based only on the current state of the map. So we can do better if we design a utility function that uses a predictive sensor model based on the expected cover area of how the sensor really behaves in practice. One example of this is the camera field of view, where if we have a frontier, we can project the camera receptive field if the robot were to go to that location, and then see actually the unknown cells that the robot will see if we have this model of our sensor. This procedure of projecting the camera field of view and seeing which cells in the occupancy map are hit is called Raycasting, and from this we can then use as an intermediate step to calculate the actual expected information gain, or the utility. This becomes very important in 3D applications such as UAVs, because we also have 6 degrees of freedom, and it becomes important from a practical point of view to determine the camera orientation as well. An following aspect is that the utility function in frontier-based exploration only considers the visibility or the coverage of the cells in the occupancy grid. As a result, we have no way of saying that certain cells are more confidently classified than others in terms of occupancy, or with less uncertainty. If we care about the map quality, as we do in many inspection applications, then we might want to design a utility function based on the concept of information theory rather than just visibility and coverage. So instead of counting the number of cells that are seen either from a particular robot pose or on a frontier region, we can now study the occupancy probability that is maintained in our occupancy map and design a utility function based on that. A very common way of doing this is by leveraging ideas of Shannon's entropy, which is just a measure for a binary random variable, how much uncertainty is associated with that variable. So Shannon's entropy tells us a measure of uncertainty, so we can develop a utility function that looks at how Shannon's entropy in the map changes if we were to take a new measurement and see which measurement leads to the highest change in entropy or the highest information gain. So in other words, we're looking at the occupancy and seeing which measurement influences the values of occupancy in the greatest possible way, and not just counting the number of unknown cells. So this is a way of doing planning with a utility function based on the map quality. Another key element, and an obvious one, is that we use a myopic, greedy exploration strategy, which is susceptible to getting stuck in local minima. And though it is simple to implement, if we have a situation such as this, where we have several frontiers adjacent to each other, it would make sense to plan a tour by considering all the frontier areas at once. So we need an optimization problem that considers multiple possible candidates for generating an actual path, rather than just considering next best view planning. So designing a planning algorithm like this involves reasoning over a sequence of actions in a non-myopic way. In computer science, this problem of combinatorially optimizing several possible waypoints or locations is sometimes known as the traveling salesman problem, and this is a term that's sometimes used in literature when discussing informative planning. Here, the basic idea is that we have a salesman that has to travel between several cities, and he knows the distance between these cities. So what is the shortest possible route our salesman can take in order to travel all the cities? This is exactly the same question we're asking here with frontiers. How can the robot make the most out of its limited budget, its limited battery life, and visit all the frontiers in the shortest possible amount of time? And when we start thinking about reasoning over longer paths, we also want a utility function that accounts for distance and time within it. So even though there might be an extremely promising measurement point a long way away in terms of information value, maybe it doesn't make sense to travel that much in order to acquire that new information, but rather explore some intermediate rewards in the robot's proximity instead. So one common way of managing this is designing utility functions that account for distance and time to compare paths over different length and time scales. One way of doing this is by considering the information gain rate rather than just the information gain. So here we somehow scale the information value. This could be either an entropy-based criterion or visibility by the cost or the travel time or path length. And so if we have different paths with different lengths and information value associated with them, we now have a common unit which we can use to evaluate them to decide on the most promising next action. Another way of managing this is using an exponential factor in our utility function. So here what we do is we take our information gain and we scale it by an exponential factor depending on the cost of that path. Again, the cost is the path length or the travel time. And here we see an exponential factor which controls the rate of this decay or how much we want to penalize paths based on their cost. So finally, in the exploration part of the lecture, we want to introduce a new paradigm emerging in recent years for doing exploration in very high-dimensional spaces and on computationally constrained platforms, such as the UAV. And this is related to the examples that we saw in the beginning. So just like in classical path planning, a way of handling very large dimensional configuration spaces is by sampling. So we essentially probe the configuration space as the robot explores the environment to see which actions lead to the highest information gain. And this is a key idea that's been used recently in literature, and we're going to go through one popular algorithm, receding horizon tree-based exploration planner presented in this paper, just to have an idea of how this works. Now, there are also other works out there and different variants of this algorithm, but this is just to understand and to appreciate how a sampling-based method could be effective in handling places where combinatorial optimization and greedy frontier-based exploration is infeasible. So the tree-based exploration planner works in a very simple way, similar to the rapidly exploring random tree. So the basic idea is to create a random tree in an initially unknown environment by sampling new configurations from the robot configuration space. So here we see a UAV exploring an environment and a tree being generated by sampling. And now for each node of the tree, for the informative planning problem, the key idea is to store the utility or the information gain associated with each node of the tree. So every time we sample the tree, we have some value associated with it, telling us how promising it is for the robot exploration problem. And we can use this information in order to develop paths in the tree that the robot should follow to maximize its exploration information gathering mission. So the way that we develop information gain is just like we saw on the previous slide. For the tree, we look at the gain of a particular node as the gain of the previous node, so the parent one, plus the new information that we gain using the sensor model and the current state of the map. So if the robot were to travel to this new sample location, we can project the field of view and see what are the visible voxels in the coverage case from that point. Then if we know the visibility associated with that configuration, we can scale it by the distance that it took to get there from the parent node. So the distance of that path segment from the candidate node to the parent node. And this allows us to manage different lengths of the tree. So for each node in the tree, we store this information and we keep track of the node with the highest information gain. So this is the node that leads to the most exploratory behavior adjusted for the cost. And then the way the tree-based planner works is in a receding horizon fashion. So when we have grown the tree for a given number of iterations, we stop and take the node with the highest information gain, trace its parents, and then execute only the first segment of the path towards this node. And then the robot stops and recomputes the tree using the best branch as the initialization point in order to keep track of the best solution. So this receding horizon behavior is important because the robot is actively exploring and gaining new information about the map. So every time it takes an action, it will stop and recompute the next best promising action given the current incoming measurements. So this is the tree-based exploration planner and how it works in practice. Here are some examples of experiments of a sampling-based approach. So importantly, over here we see how a sampling-based strategy that we just described compares against greedy frontier-based exploration. And so over here in the green, we can see frontier-based exploration, and in the blue, the sampling-based strategy as a robot explores the simulation apartment scenario. With the red stars, we can see the state of the tree at a particular point in time, so like a snapshot of the mission. And we can see and validate that the paths generated by these two algorithms are substantially different. And in order to compare them, we can use our performance metrics, so the explored volume over time, and see how the methods compare. And so over here in the blue, we see the proposed approach, which is the sampling-based tree planner, and the red is the frontier-based planner. So we can see, for example, in terms of occupied cells, if we measure the volume of these cells against the time of the mission, we can see that the sampling-based strategy does a little bit better because it uncovers the occupied voxels much faster. And we can see the same trends in terms of mapping the free space volume and reducing the amount of unmapped or unknown volumes in this environment. So the motivation for showing this graph is to see how we can compare different exploration strategies and the types of environments that are needed to assess the algorithms. And so typically here, because the sampling-based planner exhibits random and stochastic behavior, what we do is take many trials simulations, compute the statistics, and then present information to compare different strategies. And finally, showing a video of a similar planner that actually combines sampling-based planning with frontier-based planning, that we don't go into much detail here, but just to have a video also of how this works. We have a robot that's exploring a maze-like environment, and we can see that it quickly uncovers the space by navigating to the frontiers and with the sampling-based approach intermediately. A key insight of this particular planner is that it also optimizes the orientation of the UAV. So it figures out, using that sensor model, how to orientate the robot camera in order to maximize the information gain and complete the exploration problem most successfully. Finally, we come to the different but related application of using informative planning for robotic data collection and environmental monitoring missions. In general, the goal of these missions is to use the robot sensor to collect measurements in an efficient way about a target phenomenon occurring in the environment. Some examples are from precision agriculture. For instance, we have this UAV flying over an agricultural field. The UAV is equipped with a downward-facing camera, from which we can then extract various vegetation images based on the image channels. We can use this information then to create a map of areas of the field that are greener and have higher biomass cover. Another example comes from lake monitoring. So here's the autonomous surface vehicle we saw at the beginning of the lecture. It's equipped with a probe that it can use to put in the lake and calculate bacteria concentration at a given depth. And here's what a map obtained using this platform might look like. So we have identified a layer in the lake, a given depth that has a very high bacteria concentration, and from this we can draw various scientific conclusions and do further analysis. And there are many other examples, for example, temperature mapping or moisture mapping. So what does this problem setting have in common with exploration, and why do we treat it separately in this lecture? Well, the key difference is that exploration problems plan paths and gather information in the same occupancy map of the environment. So in the exploration problem, we have, for example, here an OctoMap, a 3D occupancy map, and we used it both to plan collision-free paths for the robot, as well as to figure out information or utility and the next most promising measurement points. In contrast, for the purposes of this lecture, when we talk about environmental data collection or monitoring, we're mostly focused on planning paths and gathering information in different types of maps. So we might have a separate map reflecting the occupancy that we can use to determine where feasible paths are, but we have a particular map that we use for the target phenomenon we're interested in observing, for example, a temperature map or a moisture map. Over here we have an example showing two different types of maps in a cluttered environment in a 2D setup. So here we planned the path with respect to some obstacles in the environment, and the paths were planned in order to capture measurements in an underlying field. Now we notice that the field doesn't have much to do with the placement of the obstacles. It's an independent phenomenon that we use a specialized sensor to observe. And this was the case in the examples that we just saw in agricultural and lake monitoring as well. So in a way, we can think of exploration as a particular subproblem with environmental data collection, but we want to make sure that this distinction is clear. So how do we model environmental phenomena? A commonly used method of probabilistic modeling for informative planning purposes and in general analysis of spatial fields is called the Gaussian process, or the GP. Now, there's a lot of theory underlying GPs, popular machine learning regression techniques, but we're just not going to go into too much details here, only explain the key elements that we need in order for informative planning to take place. The motivation for using GPs is the fact that many environmental variables that we encounter in the physical world, for example, temperature, vary smoothly, and we have clear gradients in space. So using an occupancy map or a map that assumes spatial independence would not be appropriate to accurately capture these variables because we want to figure out a way of encapsulating the dependencies within our mapping framework. So the GP is a very natural way of doing this, where we have a prior distribution of functions, and then based on some data, we can infer a posterior distribution, in a sense do a regression, and from this figure out the distribution over a field given some limited data. A GP is fully captured by a mean and a covariance, so everything within the GP is assumed to be Gaussian. It's a Gaussian distribution over functions that are given by a mean and covariance matrix. The key ingredient of the GP is a kernel function. A kernel function essentially captures how smooth our data is and how interrelated different data points are within our problem space. And this will become clear on the next slide when we look at an example. So essentially, we use this model because the kernel allows us to capture the natural smoothness of many environmental variables that are the subject of informative planning frameworks. And the way we use a GP is we have some set of training data, and we can apply GP regression equations to infer what are the values at parts of the field or the problem space that we didn't observe yet. So in this equations, we have a set of training data captured by the variable x, and we want to ask our model, what are the values? Can we estimate them at a set of different query points, which is x star? And so by using these equations, where we build the kernel matrices, we can infer the mean and the covariance. Now, the mean is the most likely distribution of our data by definition, and the covariance captures the uncertainty. And this uncertainty is extremely useful for information theoretic planning, because we have a direct way of understanding what is the confidence of our data at different points within our problem space. Now, again, understanding all the details within the equations is not necessary for this module, but the mean and covariance are the two key things that we need for the GP so that we can develop utility functions and plan next measurement locations. So to make this more understandable, let's look at a 2D example of a GP. So over here on the very far left, we have a ground truth spatial distribution of data. And this is basically the colors where the yellower shades are higher values and the bluer are lower values. So this is something that is happening in the environment. Consider a map of signal strength or temperature. Now the red dots indicate this training data X on the previous slide, where we take measurements at. So this is some data that we give to our model, and we say we have these observations available to us. And now what the model will do is take this information and apply regression over the distribution of functions to tell us the mean and covariance associated with the entire field. So our query points in this case are defined over the 2D range, over the 2D coordinate range, and our model applies regression given the data, red training data that we give it, in order to figure out the mean in the center and the covariance on the right. So on the right, we visualize the variance associated with these measurements. And by comparing the mean and the original ground truth function, we can see that our model did a very good job of figuring out what the field looks like with only a few training points. So we only took some subset of measurements in this large area, we applied regression, and we were able with to a reasonable degree capture what the field actually looks like without exhaustively taking measurements. And with the covariance function, here we see the variance over this 2D space, and one would expect a low variance associated with the points where we actually have training data, because these are the points that we actually measured, so we have less uncertainty here, therefore the variance is lower. And we can already start to see that how informative planning would fit in such a map representations, because if we have a variance, intuitively we can start to think about if there is a location with a very high variance, we have high uncertainty there, and maybe we want to direct the robot to sense there so that we can improve the confidence of our model and achieve our informative planning objective. So in the Gaussian process, natural question is, of course, how do we select the kernel? Because the kernel is the important aspect that allows us to capture the correlations and achieve this type of reliable prediction. So in practice, what we do is we train a kernel based on previous data. So we learn it from data using optimization algorithms such as minimizing the log marginal likelihood. So we're not going to go maximizing the log marginal likelihood. And this is not something we go in detail in this lecture, but in practice, what's important to take away here is that we can learn the correlations in the data from previous experiments. We can use it to apply regression to new problems, and we have a way of figuring out the most likely values and the uncertainties associated with them if we give our model entirely new query points. This is the part of Gaussian processes that is relevant for this lecture. So we already said something about measuring information in GPs, and intuitively we want to direct the robot to go to areas where there is high variance. So how can we formulate that? So this problem was extensively studied in the context of sensor placement. The sensor placement problem deals with figuring out where are the best locations to place a limited set of sensors in a static environment so that we can maximize our knowledge about the underlying field. So let's say in the previous example, we have some candidate locations where we can put sensors, and what we want to do is collect as much data as possible, minimize uncertainty. So where should we place those sensors in the environment? This is very related to informative planning, but different because it happens in a static setting. In our informative planning problem for robotic data collection, we say that the robot is mobile, it can move and take measurements, whereas the sensors placed in the static sensor placement problem are, of course, immobile and they don't have that capability. So in this paper, it was studied how to place sensors based on ideas from information theory in the most efficient way. So how to collect the most data with a limited sense of sensors. And various information theoretic measures were presented for computing the uncertainty associated in GPs. So these measures allow us to figure out the best locations to place our sensors. One of the measures presented in this paper is a simple concept of entropy, where we have a conditional entropy associated with potential sensor locations in the field that we're trying to measure. So without going too much into detail in the equation pulled from the paper, what's important to understand here is that we calculate the conditional entropy of a set of locations where we could potentially place our sensors. And we condition this, we use this to condition the entropy of all the other locations that we have not placed the sensor at. So here V is the set of all possible locations, and A is the set of possible sensor locations where we have the freedom to pick where we want to put the sensors. And now, depending on what A looks like, we can calculate the entropy or the uncertainty associated with this distribution. And obviously, because entropy is a measure of uncertainty, in the paper, the optimal sensor locations would be in the positions that minimize this conditional entropy. So this is a measure that, say, if we have a set of possible sensor locations, we can compute the conditional entropy, and this is like our utility function for the static sensor placer problem that we want to minimize. Now, another information theoretic criterion that was developed is that of mutual information. And mutual information is very similar to entropy, but it also calculates the difference between all the other locations in the environment and the conditional entropy. And as we will see on the next slide, this measure was derived from information theory because it gives us a more efficient and more intuitive way of planning where to place these sensors. The reason why these equations are here in this lecture on robotics is because these are really the key ingredients for our utility function to design information theoretic measures we can use to guide our planning algorithms. So one insight we have here is that to design utility functions in robotic applications, we often borrow ideas from other fields, such as information theory or figuring out sensor placements. But they're very relevant because the way that we capture these fields is similar. So let's compare entropy and mutual information, again in a very simple example to understand the properties of these two information measures. So on this slide we can see a field spanning a given area, and the diamonds indicate locations we want to place sensors if we were using the entropy criterion. So if our goal was to minimize entropy or uncertainty, these are locations that we would place our sensors, and this was derived through an algorithm, and depending on the properties of the field. Whereas for mutual information, we have these red squares. So now one observation that we can draw looking at this picture on a very high level is that in mutual information, our sensors are much better spaced. So in entropy, using the entropy criterion, what we end up doing is placing a lot of these sensors on the edges of the field and so-called wasting information. Because a sensor over here does not only registers things in the corner, assuming that our problem space is limited in extent. So that's the reason why a lot of works on robotic informative planning prefer to use the mutual information. It has this nice property that by looking at the difference between the entropies, the sensors or the measurement locations are much more evenly distributed. So in summary of these slides, we derived some information criteria for GPs, which is the model that we use to capture environmental phenomena. And we looked at, in practice, if we were to place measurements, how they would be spaced using these two criteria, and drew the conclusion that mutual information leads to better spacing visually. Now, by nature of the GPs, of course, because we're using a kernel to capture the spatial correlations, remember that any of these sensors is actually influencing its neighborhood as well. So for example, if we take a measurement at this location in the red square, then we can infer something about the area around it because the kernel allows us to capture smoothness. And the various parameters within that kernel function determine what the spatial field, what the underlying target parameter actually looks like. So this is just something to note and to draw the distinction between occupancy mapping, where we only looked at these cells or these voxels in the robot field of view. Over here we have this spatial interplay happening, where the sensors are influencing each other in terms of the information that they get. So this property is rather interesting and a key distinction between the models that we use for robotic exploration and robotic data collection. And this also influences the complexity of our utility function or an information objective. So this type of model behavior and these information criteria exhibit the very intuitive concept we call submodularity. Submodularity simply tells us that the amount of information we gather in the future depends on the previous trajectory. So essentially over here, if we, and we look at an example of this on the next slide, but if we took a measurement at this location in the corner, if we were now to place a sensor or guide another robot to a location very close to it, that wouldn't give us much novelty or wouldn't provide much new information for our model because we have spatial correlations. So we already learned something about this general neighborhood. So what we would want to prefer is to place the sensor somewhere further away if we haven't been there yet to learn something new about unknown areas. And submodularity essentially happens because of this spatial dependency. So we can formulate this in equation form as well, and if we draw the sort of Venn diagram, we can see that because our sets of measurement locations actually now depend on each other, our problem exhibits the submodularity. This can also be formulated in the so-called diminishing returns property, where if we have a new sensor location that we want to add to a set, the value that we gain from adding that sensor to a smaller set is much higher than to a larger one. And so if we look at an example of diminishing returns, this will become much clearer from an intuitive point of view. So over here we have a sensor that we want to place when monitoring a 2D field, just like in the previous examples. And on the top here, we have two sensors placed already, and we want to add the third one. Whereas on the bottom, we have placed 4, and we want to add the 5th. Now, intuitively, the value that we gain from adding an additional sensor in this first scenario will be much higher than in the second one, when we have already learned a lot about the environment using the sensors that we already have. And this can also be appreciated visually by looking at the fact that the area covered by this new sensor overlaps in a very limited way with respect to the other sensor spheres of influence, as compared to the bottom, where the presence of this extra sensor actually overlaps. So we already know something in this environment, and therefore the gain from adding an additional sensor in this location will not be too high. And this is all these equations on submodularity are trying to tell us. So now we have learned something about using GPs as our environmental model, as well as how we can calculate information in a GP, and submodularity, a key property that emerges if we want to plan multiple sensing locations in a GP. So let's go back into robotics and think about planning strategies and how we can use this map representation and this conceptual utility function to get the robot to move and collect measurements. So, as before, a very simple strategy is to use greedy myopic planning. So this is simply going to the next best sensing location. So if a robot starts at a point, we look at the entropy or the mutual information often associated with the next best sensing location, and we move there in order to optimize that objective function. And this is what was designed in the context of sensor placement in the referenced work, where a recursive greedy algorithm was derived with a polynomial approximation and theoretical bounds on optimal performance. Another strategy that one could use that is more applicable for robotic scenarios is grid-based planning. So in discrete space methods, as we said before, we generate a grid of possible locations that the robot could visit and then try to plan a path based on the information value through these locations. So one very popular method in discrete space planning, based on the concept that were presented here, is the branch and bound algorithm. The branch and bound is an exhaustive search on a grid of locations that uses a method of pruning to efficiently take away locations in the search space that will not lead to better solutions than the one that we already have. So we're somehow trying to prune branches in our branch and bound algorithm so that we can find the best possible location using an exhaustive search without it getting too computationally complex. So very intuitively, an example from the branch and bound algorithm we see here is if we want the robot to collect measurements, but we pose the constraint that the robot must start on the bottom left of the environment and end up on the top right. And we want to see which kind of measurements we can get in this grid. And we say that the robot only has 6 steps that it's allowed to take before reaching the end goal. So it starts at the end, it needs to take 6 motions and finish. It starts at the start, it has to take 6 sensing actions and end up at the end. So if the robot has taken 1 action, using the branch and bound algorithm, we prune locations that are not reachable. So we cannot go to these 3 white nodes of the graph without using budget that conflicts with our requirement to reach the end goal on the last position. And we can do the same thing if we recurse another time. So if we take 2 steps, we do not consider these nodes anymore in our search. And this is how the branch and bound algorithm achieves some efficiency when it plans informative paths on grids. And this algorithm was deployed again in an aquatic scenario to plan paths for autonomous surface vehicle. Now, if we want to think about continuous space methods that could potentially lead to more flexible paths and higher quality ones, one natural way related to our discussion in the robotic exploration part of the lecture is to use sampling-based planning. So a very common strategy is a state-of-the-art sampling-based algorithm for these applications is called this rapidly information gathering tree or RIG tree. And without going into too much detail about this algorithm and its operational principles, they're very similar to the receding horizon next best view planner we saw in the exploration part. So essentially, we're trying to construct a geometric tree in this 2D environment, trying to take measurements of a field of interest. And as we grow the tree, we have a cost and an information gain associated with every single node. And we want to keep track of the most promising branch of the tree and execute that when we collect measurements. And here we can see different time steps as to how the tree grows and how the best solution evolves. So over here, we're planning using a GP representation reflected by the smoothness with an submodular objective function. In the paper introducing the RIG tree with the citation on the bottom, we can also, if you're interested, look at some pruning methods for improving the efficiency of this search, and similar to branch and bound, getting rid of the solutions that won't lead to those better than the one that we already have. So here's another example of the RIG tree in action in a practical scenario of monitoring signal strength on a lake. And so over here we see on the left image and the central one 2 different budgets for informative planning. And in yellow we can see the path that was produced by the branch and bound algorithm that exhibits this familiar regularity of the underlying grid we use for discrete space planning. And in yellow we can see the path that was generated with the rapidly information gathering tree. So we can see how by planning in the continuous space using the same objective function, we actually get rather different paths and we're much more flexible in our data collection strategy. On the right, we see a full survey that was done manually by a human operator to collect regular data in this environment. And this is a common approach that we take in research to evaluate such informative planning algorithms. We collect some ground truth data, and then based on that, we can measure different error in our final maps that were obtained using different algorithms and compare them. But one also notes here that the full survey with the human operator took significantly longer than either of those that was executed using informative planning. And also the dispersion of the measurements is significantly different, because here we take a regular and uniform approach to collecting information to generate the ground truth, whereas with the informative planning strategies, we're able to focus in a targeted way of collecting information in particular areas with respect to the map representation. So another way of generating continuous space plans is using trajectory optimization-based approaches. So here we see an example of a continuous informative path planning algorithm that was used for lake monitoring applications. So let's focus on the left-hand picture here. So we see in purple a path that was created by the branch and bound algorithm to collect information in the 2D spatial field modeled by a Gaussian process. And on with the green, we see the continuous path planning strategy that's based on using an evolutionary optimization technique to evaluate the utility of potential measurement points along this trajectory. So again, without going into too much detail, the way this algorithm works is that it selects a sequence of waypoints to parameterize a trajectory. So it connects smoothly using a spine, a sequence of waypoints, and then based on the measurement locations along that trajectory, we can extract information and see the value associated with that trajectory. And what the algorithm does is uses a black box evolutionary optimization technique, trying to improve trajectories by computing and refining, evolving new candidates and figuring out the best one. So again, similar to the Raycasting sampling-based example, the path that was generated using the continuous space trajectory optimization strategy here is significantly different from the branch and bound. And the key takeaway there is that continuous space planning gives us much more flexibility and freedom to tune our paths and particular segments for flexibility for data collection. And over here we can see some typical graphs that we find in papers on robotic informative planning. So here we can see a comparison of two variants of the continuous informative path planning strategy with the evolutionary optimization routine and the classical branch and bound grid-based search strategy. So we can see that thanks to the flexibility it has in generating new paths and the combination with the evolutionary optimization, this algorithm achieves higher relative objective values on average compared to the grid-based strategy, which is very restricted by the discretization of the grid that we have to impose. And on the right, we can see also some comparisons of computation time. So if we have a longer budget, the branch and bound grid-based search strategy actually takes much longer because it needs to exhaustively search a much larger space in a similar way as if we had a denser grid that we were using to do planning in this algorithm. So this is just some very typical kind of metrics that we use to evaluate informative planning algorithms and drawing on some of the distinctions between discrete and continuous planning for this problem setup. And finally, inspired by this continuous informative path planning approach, we also designed within our research group a trajectory optimization routine focusing on terrain monitoring applications. So whereas on the previous slide here, we were generating trajectories in the 2D space by shifting the control waypoints of the spline, now we do the same thing but in 3D. So we consider a UAV flying over a field, for example an agricultural field as shown, and we want to generate parameterized trajectories in this space and optimize them for maximized information gain. So here are some results from the simulation. So we assume a downward-facing camera on this UAV, and we use that in order to measure a 2D field, information on a 2D field. So the information landscape, in contrast with the previous example, is, well, it's similar in the sense that it's 2D, but the robot workspace is actually 3D. And this is one of the particularly interesting things about this terrain monitoring application in the environmental data collection. So we can see some of the trajectories that were generated using the same, leveraging the same evolutionary optimization technique in this particular problem, and in a relatively short amount of time, the UAV explores the environment, completing the map. And in the hatched areas, we see some thresholds on areas that we consider to be uninteresting and interesting based on the values of the target parameter. So in this situation, it would be interesting, for example, to look at areas of very high vegetation index on the field and allow the robot to focus on them in a targeted way to collect more information. Whereas for some lower valued regions, such as in the hatched regions, we might want to eliminate them for our information objective. This is just some insight as to how we can exploit the full possibility of using online adaptive planning in environmental monitoring applications such as this one. And finally, within our research group, we also deploy these algorithms on board physical platforms. So moving on from the simulated and the theoretical world, here we see some of the informative path planning algorithms actually running on board the UAV, which is doing also outdoor state estimation and using that as information in order to project measurements and build the map of the environment. So this problem is a very interesting one because now we actually have robots on the field that can do things by themselves in an intelligent way based on these key modules of mapping, utility calculation, and planning running on board and in real time. So the robot could also react to the data that it collects and use this to guide its next sensing actions. So in this example, here is a real-world images of the data that was gathered during that mission from the video. So the UAV here was monitoring some weed and crop areas on an agricultural field, and we can see how the maps get more complete over time with the weed and soil and crop regions successfully identified in the end. And the smoothness over here that's emerging due to the correlated nature of the map that we're maintaining based on our GP prior. On the right, this is just a simple illustration of the map uncertainty reducing over time to confirm that our algorithm actually does things as expected. So by doing informative planning, we're able to make a more complete map and also reduce its uncertainty. And this is kind of the beauty of this GP-based planning mapping approach for planning, is that we have access to the actual values of the measurements via the mean, but also the uncertainty measures from the covariance matrix. So finally, we come to the end of this lecture on exploration and informative planning. So to start, we looked at the robotic information gathering problem and some areas of application where it would be beneficial. We also discussed the three key elements underlying systems for informative planning, which were environmental mapping, utility calculation, as well as the planning algorithm. We addressed some of the challenges in each of these categories, as well as how they're interconnected. An important takeaway here was that in informative planning, we often have the trade-off between computational efficiency and the quality of the informative plans that we generate. Next, we looked at the particular application of robotic exploration. So this is when a robot was navigating in a partially known or unknown environment, gathering measurements in order to build an occupancy map as quickly as possible. We looked at exploration strategies based on the map frontiers, as well as some potential improvements in different ways. And finally, in the last part of the lecture, we focused on robotic data collection and environmental monitoring, where we maintain a map on some environmental phenomenon we're interested in observing, typically using a Gaussian process. We derived some information theoretic measures to develop utility functions and saw some practical planning algorithms that we could use in these applications.